The Montana summer sun beat down mercilessly on Jackson Hargrove's weathered face as he surveyed what remained of his once thriving cattle ranch. 3 months without rain had turned the pastures into dusty wastelands, and the creek that had reliably watered his herd for 15 years had dwindled to little more than a trickle. At 48, Jackson had survived the Civil War, 2 harsh winters that nearly wiped out his stock, and the death of his wife 7 years prior, but this drought threatened everything he'd built. His calloused hands gripped the reins of his chestnut stallion as his gaze drifted to the adjacent property, the Wellington homestead, with its year-round spring that fed into a pond substantial enough to water twice the cattle he owned. Martha Wellington, who'd inherited the land when her father died last autumn, had rebuffed his every offer to purchase water rights. Today, that would change. He had no choice if his 200 head of cattle were to survive another week in this punishing heat. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe to the channel. I'd love to know what city you're watching from. Now, back to our tale of the Old West. Jackson nudged his horse forward, the animal's hooves kicking up small clouds of dust with each step toward the modest cabin that sat on the edge of the Wellington property. The place wasn't much, a simple 1-story structure with a small vegetable garden out back and a barn that had seen better days. But that spring was worth its weight in gold, especially now. As he approached, he saw Martha hanging laundry, her honey-blonde hair tied back with a ribbon, sleeves rolled up to her elbows. At 32, she was a handsome woman, not beautiful in the conventional sense, but strong-featured, with clear blue eyes that reminded Jackson of the Montana sky in winter. She spotted him coming and straightened, one hand shielding her eyes from the sun, the other reflexively reaching for the pocket of her apron, where Jackson knew she kept a small derringer. "Mr. Hargrove," she called out, her voice carrying across the yard. "If you've come to make another offer on my water, you can turn right around. My answer hasn't changed since yesterday, or the day before that." She stood her ground as he dismounted, tying his horse to the weathered fence post at the edge of her property. Martha Wellington had inherited not just her father's land, but his stubborn disposition as well. Old Man Wellington had been a hard-nosed homesteader who'd carved this plot out of wild territory, fighting off rustlers and surviving harsh winters through sheer force of will. His daughter, it seemed, was cut from the same cloth, which under different circumstances would have been an admirable quality. Jackson removed his hat, wiping sweat from his brow with his forearm. "Miss Wellington, I'm not here to waste your time or mine. The situation has changed." He took a step forward, his spurs jingling softly against the hard-packed earth. "I've lost 17 head this week alone. Good breeding stock. At this rate, I'll have nothing left by month's end." He watched her expression, searching for any sign of sympathy, but her face remained impassive. "I'm prepared to make you a different kind of proposition today." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Jackson hadn't planned on taking this approach, but desperation had a way of altering a man's course. Martha's eyes narrowed suspiciously. She dealt with enough men trying to swindle her out of her inheritance since her father's passing to recognize when someone was about to make an unusual offer. "I'm not interested in any proposition that separates me from what's rightfully mine, Mr. Hargrove." She picked up her laundry basket, clutching it to her chest like a shield. "My father built this place from nothing, worked himself into an early grave to ensure I'd have something of my own. I don't intend to dishonor his memory by selling to the first man who comes along with empty promises and half-hearted offers." She turned to walk back toward her cabin, considering the conversation finished. "I'm taking your land, Miss Wellington," Jackson called after her, his voice firm but not threatening. The statement stopped her in her tracks. She turned slowly, disbelief etched across her features as he continued. "I filed a claim with Judge Wilson yesterday. The territorial water rights law gives precedence to established ranching operations over homesteads in times of severe drought. This wasn't entirely true. The law was ambiguous at best, but Jackson was betting that Martha wouldn't know the finer points of territorial statutes. Judge Wilson granted me emergency access to your spring, effective immediately. I've got the papers to prove it." He reached into his vest pocket, producing a folded document that bore what appeared to be an official seal. Martha set down her basket with deliberate slowness, her hands trembling slightly. Whether from anger or fear, Jackson couldn't tell. "You can't do this," she whispered. Then more loudly, "You can't just take what isn't yours." She marched toward him, her initial shock giving way to indignation. "My father knew men like you, vultures circling, waiting for someone vulnerable. Well, I am not vulnerable, Mr. Hargrove. I'll fight this all the way to the territorial governor if I have to." She reached for the document, but Jackson held it just beyond her grasp, forcing her to look up at him, to acknowledge the nearly foot difference in their heights. "You can fight it," Jackson conceded, returning the paper to his pocket. "But by the time the matter's settled, winter will be here, and it won't much matter who has legal right to the water." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a more conciliatory tone. "I'm not looking to leave you with nothing, Miss Wellington. I'm a reasonable man." He gestured toward the small cabin and the surrounding land. "You can stay on here. Keep your garden, your chickens. I'll even help repair that roof that's been leaking since spring. All I need is access to the water for my cattle until the drought breaks." He paused, watching the warring emotions play across her face. "Or there's another way." Martha took a step back, wariness replacing her anger. "What other way?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected his answer. Jackson Hargrove had a reputation in these parts. A fair man by most accounts, hardworking and honest in his dealings. But he was also known for his single-mindedness, his unwavering determination once he set his mind to something. Right now, his mind was set on her spring, and Martha had enough experience with determined men to know they rarely took no for an answer. She crossed her arms defensively, waiting for him to continue, searching for any sign that he was bluffing about the legal claim. Jackson surveyed the Wellington property, taking in the untended fields, the garden that produced barely enough to feed one person, the disrepair that had crept in around the edges since Old Man Wellington's passing. "This land needs a man's touch, Miss Wellington. You're doing your best, I can see that, but winter's coming, and you'll be facing it alone." He gestured to the western horizon, where dark clouds were gathering, the promise of a storm that would likely skirt the drought-stricken valley as so many had in recent months. "The only way to keep this land, all of it, legal and proper, is to be my wife." Martha's laughter cut through the afternoon air, startling a pair of magpies from a nearby tree. "Your wife?" she repeated incredulously, as if she couldn't possibly have heard him correctly. "Mr. Hargrove, I would sooner marry one of my chickens." She shook her head, blonde tendrils escaping her ribbon to frame her flushed face. "You must be more desperate than I thought if you believe threatening a woman is the way to win her hand." She picked up her laundry basket again, clutching it to her chest like armor. "Now, get off my property before I decide to test whether this drought has affected my aim with Daddy's shotgun." Jackson remained unmoved, his weathered face betraying no emotion save for a slight tightening around his eyes. "This isn't a threat, Miss Wellington. It's a practical solution. He gestured to the parched landscape surrounding them. Your land and mine, joined together, would make one of the most prosperous ranches in the territory. You get security, protection, a name that carries weight with the territorial authorities. I get the water my cattle need to survive. He took a step closer, his voice lowering. And neither of us has to face another Montana winter alone. There was something in the way he said it, a hint of vulnerability beneath the pragmatic exterior, that gave Martha pause. The silence that followed was broken only by the distant lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through the dry grass. Martha studied Jackson's face, searching for any sign of duplicity. At 48, he was 16 years her senior. But the years had been kind to him, the silver streaking his dark hair and the lines etched around his eyes spoke of experience rather than age. He stood straight-backed and strong, a man accustomed to hard work and harsh conditions. Not handsome in the way the young cowboys who occasionally passed through town were handsome, but solid, substantial. The kind of man her father might have approved of had circumstances been different. "You can't be serious," she finally said, though her tone held more confusion than outrage now. "I've never been more serious in my life," Jackson replied, taking off his hat and holding it respectfully against his chest. "I'm not offering romance, Miss Wellington. I'm offering partnership, a combining of resources and strengths that benefits us both." He gestured toward the horizon, where his own property lay. "I've built something substantial out of wilderness. 3,000 acres, 200 head of prime breeding stock, a house with glass windows shipped all the way from St. Louis." A hint of pride colored his voice. "It's a good life, but a solitary one. And solitary doesn't survive long out here." He replaced his hat, his eyes never leaving hers. "Think about it. That's all I'm asking." Martha's mind raced with conflicting thoughts. The sheer audacity of his proposal left her speechless. He had essentially threatened to take her land by legal force, then offered marriage as though it were some kind of generous alternative. Yet beneath her indignation, a small, practical voice, one that sounded suspiciously like her father's, whispered that she should at least consider the offer. The drought had hit her hard too. The vegetable garden was yielding barely enough to sustain her, and the small flock of chickens wouldn't get her through the winter. She'd been avoiding thinking about the future, focusing instead on day-to-day survival. But the harsh reality was that her prospects were limited. "I need time to think," she finally said, surprising herself with the admission. This isn't the kind of proposal a woman accepts on the spot, Mr. Hargrove." She looked past him to where his horse waited patiently at the fence line, then back to his face, searching for any hint of triumph or manipulation. Finding none, she continued, "If what you say about the water rights claim is true, I need to see those papers, and I'll need to speak with Judge Wilson myself." She straightened her shoulders, attempting to project a confidence she didn't entirely feel. "I'm not some naive schoolgirl who will take a man at his word when my livelihood is at stake." Jackson nodded, a hint of respect flickering in his eyes. "Fair enough. I'll leave the papers with you." He reached into his vest pocket and withdrew the folded document, extending it toward her. As Martha reached for it, their fingers brushed briefly, sending an unexpected jolt through her that she immediately tried to dismiss as simple static electricity. "Take your time, Miss Wellington, but not too much time. My cattle need water now, not next week." He turned to leave, then paused, looking back at her over his shoulder. "I'll return tomorrow afternoon for your answer. Either way, my men will be diverting water from your spring by sundown tomorrow. Whether they're doing it as your employees or as mine remains your choice." As Jackson mounted his horse and rode away, Martha stood clutching the document, watching his figure grow smaller against the vast Montana landscape. Only when he had disappeared beyond the ridge did she allow her shoulders to slump, the facade of strength momentarily abandoned. She unfolded the paper with trembling hands, her eyes scanning the legal jargon, filled with terms she barely understood. The official-looking seal at the bottom certainly seemed authentic, though Martha had little experience with such matters. Her father had handled all legal issues during his lifetime, believing that such things were beyond a woman's comprehension or concern. Now, she found herself wishing she had paid more attention when he discussed territorial laws with neighboring ranchers. Inside her cabin, Martha sat at the small wooden table, the documents spread before her. The interior was sparsely furnished but meticulously clean, a testament to her determination to maintain standards despite her circumstances. A small shelf held her few books, treasured possessions that connected her to the world beyond the Montana Territory. Her mother's china teacup, miraculously unbroken after the arduous journey west years ago, sat on a shelf above the fireplace. These small touches of civilization, of femininity, were her quiet rebellion against the harsh wilderness surrounding her. Now they seemed like fragile reminders of a life that was slipping away from her grasp. The following morning dawned clear and cool, with the promise of another scorching day ahead. Martha had barely slept, her mind churning with the implications of Jackson's proposal and the apparent legal claim he had on her water source. She had risen before dawn, donned her best and only dress, and harnessed her aging mare to the small wagon her father had built. The journey to town would take most of the morning, but she was determined to speak with Judge Wilson herself before giving Jackson any kind of answer. The road stretched before her, rutted and dusty, a fitting metaphor for the difficult path she now found herself traveling. Silver Creek was little more than a collection of wooden buildings strung along a single main street. But it was the closest thing to civilization within a day's ride. The courthouse, such as it was, occupied the upper floor of the general store, where Judge Wilson held proceedings 3 days a week when he wasn't tending to his own ranch 10 miles north. Martha tied her mare to the hitching post, brushed the dust from her skirt as best she could, and climbed the exterior staircase with resolute steps. The landing creaked beneath her weight, the wood warped from years of Montana weather extremes. She hesitated at the door marked Territorial Court, gathering her courage before knocking firmly. "Enter," called a gruff voice from within. Martha pushed open the door to find Judge Wilson seated behind a cluttered desk, wire-rimmed spectacles perched on his bulbous nose as he reviewed a stack of papers. At 65, Wilson was the oldest serving official in the county, a former cavalry officer whose no-nonsense approach to justice had earned him the respect of most settlers in the region. He looked up as Martha entered, his bushy eyebrows rising in mild surprise. "Miss Wellington," he acknowledged, setting down his pen. "This is an unexpected pleasure. What brings you to town?" His tone was courteous, but reserved, the way most men in authority addressed women who appeared in their domain. Martha approached the desk, the document from Jackson clutched in her hand. "Judge Wilson, I need to know if this is genuine," she said without preamble, placing the paper before him. "Mr. Hargrove claims you've granted him water rights to my spring due to the drought. He's threatening to divert my water for his cattle unless—" She hesitated, suddenly aware of how the rest of her sentence might sound. "Unless we come to a private arrangement," she finished, a slight flush coloring her cheeks. Judge Wilson's eyebrows rose even higher as he picked up the document, studying it through his spectacles with deliberate care. After what seemed an eternity, the judge removed his glasses and fixed Martha with a penetrating stare. "This document appears to be in order, Miss Wellington," he said carefully. "The territorial statutes do indeed prioritize established ranching operations during declared drought emergencies. Hargrove's operation qualifies as established. Been running cattle on that land for what, 15 years now?" He shrugged, an apologetic gesture that did little to soften the blow of his words. "Your father's homestead claim is more recent and primarily agricultural rather than pastoral. The law favors Hargrove in this instance." He handed the paper back to her, his expression softening slightly at the dismay evident on her face. Martha stared at the document in disbelief. "But this is my land, my water," she protested, her voice rising slightly. "Passed to me legally by my father. How can the territory simply give a man rights to what's mine because he has more cattle?" She was aware of the tremor in her voice, but couldn't suppress it entirely. Judge Wilson sighed, leaning back in his creaking chair, fingers steepled before him, in a gesture that suggested he'd had this conversation many times before with many different settlers. "The territory values productive use of resources, Miss Wellington," he explained, his tone that of a teacher addressing a slow but well-meaning pupil. "Hargrove's operation produces beef that feeds mining camps and growing settlements across 3 counties. It employs a dozen men. It represents significant tax revenue." He gestured vaguely toward the window, beyond which lay the vast Montana wilderness. "Your homestead, while legally yours, produces little beyond what sustains you. In the eyes of the territorial government, Hargrove's need currently outweighs your claim." He paused, studying her face. "I understand he's offered an alternative solution. A private arrangement, you said?" The flush on Martha's cheeks deepened. "He's proposed marriage," she admitted, the words sounding even more preposterous when spoken aloud in the judge's office. "Says joining our properties would solve both our problems." She straightened her shoulders, determined not to appear as vulnerable as she felt. "I came to town hoping to discover he was bluffing about the legal claim. Now I find he wasn't." She folded the document carefully, tucking it into her pocket. "Thank you for your time, Judge Wilson. At least now I know where I stand." She turned to leave, dignity intact, despite the sinking feeling in her stomach. "Miss Wellington," the judge called after her, causing her to pause at the threshold. "For what it's worth, Jackson Hargrove is known to be a man of his word. I've never heard of him dealing unfairly, even with those he could easily overpower." He cleared his throat awkwardly. "And winters are harsh for those living alone out here. Perhaps his proposal deserves more consideration than your initial reaction might suggest." Martha nodded stiffly without turning around, then stepped through the doorway, letting it close firmly behind her. She didn't need another man telling her what was best for her future. The ride back to her homestead gave Martha ample time to consider her options, none of which seemed particularly appealing. She could fight the water rights claim, but that would require legal representation she couldn't afford and would likely extend beyond the immediate crisis of the drought. She could attempt to sell her property, but with the water rights now compromised, its value was significantly reduced. She could simply abandon the land, seeking employment in town, or even traveling to one of the larger settlements, like Helena or Bozeman. Or she could accept Jackson Hargrove's proposal, becoming the wife of a man she barely knew, a man who had essentially coerced her into considering marriage. As her homestead came into view, Martha noticed a group of men and horses gathered near the spring that fed her pond. Her hands tightened on the reins, anger surging through her at this invasion, this physical manifestation of the legal theft Judge Wilson had confirmed. As she drew closer, she recognized Jackson's tall figure among the workers, directing the placement of wooden sluices that would divert a portion of the spring's flow toward his property. He looked up at the sound of her approaching wagon, raising a hand in greeting, as though they were neighbors, meeting on amicable terms, rather than adversaries in a conflict over resources. "You didn't wait for my answer," Martha called out as she pulled her wagon to a halt, not bothering to hide the accusation in her tone. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the land as 5 of Jackson's ranch hands continued their work, barely glancing up at her arrival. They were digging a narrow channel from the spring toward the property line, where wooden troughs would carry the water to Hargrove's parched pastures. Jackson approached her wagon, removing his hat in what seemed like genuine deference rather than mock courtesy. Up close, Martha could see the exhaustion etched in the lines around his eyes. The toll the drought had taken on him, as surely as it had on his cattle. "I said my men would begin diverting water by sundown today," Jackson reminded her, his voice level and unchallenging. "The papers give me the right to do so, as I imagine Judge Wilson confirmed." He gestured toward the workers. "I've instructed them to ensure your pond remains at least half full. That should be more than adequate for your needs." There was no triumph in his manner, no gloating over his victory. If anything, he seemed weary of the whole business, a man doing what necessity demanded, rather than what desire suggested. "Have you given any thought to my proposal?" he asked directly, eyes meeting hers without flinching. Martha stepped down from the wagon, unwilling to remain seated while he stood, unwilling to cede even that small physical advantage. "I've thought of little else," she admitted, brushing dust from her skirt, "though I fail to see how you can call it a proposal when you've left me no real choice in the matter." She gestured toward the men working at the spring. "You've already taken what you wanted. Why would you still offer marriage when you've achieved your aim?" The question had bothered her throughout the ride home. If Jackson already had legal right to her water, why complicate matters with a wife he didn't love or particularly desire? "I've achieved a temporary solution to an immediate crisis," Jackson corrected her, squinting against the setting sun. "But the drought will end eventually, and then we'll be neighbors with bad blood between us. That serves neither of us well in this territory." He took a step closer, lowering his voice so the workers couldn't overhear. "And I meant what I said about facing winters alone. This land breaks solitary people, Miss Wellington. Your father understood that. It's why he never remarried after your mother passed. He had you to share the burden." His eyes held hers, unflinching and direct. "Who do you have now?" The question struck deeper than Martha cared to admit. Since her father's death, loneliness had been her constant companion, more oppressive some days than the physical challenges of maintaining the homestead. There were weeks when the only human voice she heard was her own, speaking to chickens, or singing softly to herself in the evenings, to break the profound silence of the Montana nights. Still, she wasn't about to admit this vulnerability to Jackson Hargrove. "I've managed thus far," she replied stiffly, "and I would continue to manage if given the chance." "No doubt you would," Jackson agreed, surprising her with the ready acknowledgement. "You're your father's daughter in that respect, stubborn as they come." There was something like admiration in his tone. "But managing isn't the same as living, Miss Wellington. And out here, the line between surviving and truly living grows thinner with each passing season." He gestured toward the workers again, who were now placing the wooden troughs at the end of the newly dug channel. I'll tell them to stop if that's your wish. We can tear up that legal document, pretend this conversation never happened. Martha's eyes narrowed suspiciously. And in exchange, I marry you just like that? She studied his face, searching for some hint of the true motivation behind this strange proposal. Jackson Hargrove could have any number of women in the territory. Widowers with established ranches or prime catches, in a land where eligible men outnumbered women 3-1. Why focus his attention on a stubborn spinster with nothing but a small homestead and a spring? What is it you really want from me, Mr. Hargrove? If it's just the water, you already have legal claim to it. If it's the land itself, you could likely buy me out for a fraction of what it's worth, now that the water rights are compromised. Jackson's expression softened slightly, a hint of something Martha couldn't quite identify, flickering across his weathered features. What I want, Miss Wellington, is exactly what I've said. A partnership. 2 adjacent properties joined legally and properly, operated as one substantial ranch that could weather droughts like this one without resorting to legal maneuvering or coercion. He paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully. And I want what every man out here wants eventually. A home that's more than just shelter. A place to return to at day's end that offers companionship along with comfort. You're asking me to give up my independence, my name, my very identity, Martha countered, though with less heat than before. To become an appendage to Jackson Hargrove's ranch empire. Another piece of property to be managed and maintained. She glanced toward the cabin her father had built, the small garden she had expanded, the barn whose roof she had patched herself after last winter's heavy snows. These were her achievements, her stake in this harsh but beautiful land. The thought of surrendering them, even in exchange for greater security, sent a pang of genuine grief through her chest. Jackson shook his head, a hint of frustration creeping into his expression. That's not what I'm offering, and I think you know it. He gestured broadly, encompassing both properties with the sweep of his arm. This would be our ranch, yours and mine. Your input, your knowledge of this land would be as valuable as mine. I'm not looking for a housekeeper, Miss Wellington, or a cook, or whatever else you imagine I might want from a wife. His voice dropped lower. I'm looking for a partner, someone to stand beside me, not behind me. Martha was silent for a long moment, the only sounds the rhythmic digging of shovels and the occasional whinny of horses. The sun was sinking lower, casting the landscape in a golden glow that softened its harsh edges. It would be dark soon, and she would be alone again in the cabin that increasingly felt too large for just one person. I need more time, she finally said. This isn't a decision to be made hastily, regardless of the circumstances that prompted it. She met Jackson's gaze directly. I'll give you my answer tomorrow morning, and until then, I'd appreciate it if your men would suspend their work on my property. To her surprise, Jackson nodded without hesitation. Boys, he called out to the workers, that's enough for today. Pack up the tools and head back to the ranch. The men looked up, clearly surprised by the order, but too disciplined to question it openly. They began gathering their equipment, exchanging curious glances and whispered comments. Jackson turned back to Martha, his expression serious. Tomorrow morning, then. I'll come alone, and I'll respect whatever decision you make. He replaced his hat, tipping the brim slightly in a gesture of farewell. Good evening, Miss Wellington. The night passed slowly for Martha, each hour marked by the soft ticking of her father's pocket watch on the table beside her bed. Sleep eluded her as she weighed her options, attempting to separate practical considerations from emotional reactions. By dawn, she had reached no clear conclusion. her thoughts circling endlessly around the same questions. What kind of life would she have as Jackson Hargrove's wife? Would it be a true partnership as he claimed? Or would she gradually be relegated to domestic duties, her opinions on ranch matters ignored or dismissed? And what of affection, of the possibility of love developing between them? Jackson had made no mention of such sentiments, presenting their potential union as purely practical. Could she be satisfied with such an arrangement, or would the absence of tenderness leave her more lonely than she already was? As promised, Jackson arrived alone shortly after sunrise, riding the same chestnut stallion he'd been mounted on the previous day. Martha watched his approach from her cabin window, her heart beating a rapid tattoo against her ribs. She had dressed with care in her mother's blue calico dress, the nicest garment she possessed, though she couldn't have said exactly why she felt the need to make such an effort. Perhaps it was simply to remind herself that regardless of her decision, she was Martha Wellington, a woman of substance and dignity, not merely a homesteader in distress or a potential bride of convenience. She stepped onto the cabin's small porch as Jackson dismounted, tying his horse to the same fence post as before. He too had made an effort with his appearance, she noticed. His usually stubbled jaw was clean-shaven, his dark hair slicked back with water, his shirt freshly laundered. These small concessions to formality suggested that whatever his primary motivations, he respected the gravity of the situation they found themselves in. He approached the porch, removing his hat as he had the day before, waiting for her to speak first, a courtesy that Martha found herself unexpectedly appreciating. "I've considered your proposal, Mr. Hargrove," she began, her voice steadier than she had feared it might be, "and I've decided to accept, with conditions." She saw surprise flicker across his features, quickly masked by a more neutral expression. Perhaps he had expected outright rejection, or perhaps he was simply taken aback by her businesslike approach to what most would consider a romantic matter. "I want our arrangement clearly defined before we proceed. If we are to be partners, as you claim, then I want that partnership formalized in writing, not merely assumed based on marital vows." Jackson climbed the porch steps slowly, maintaining a respectful distance as he considered her words. "What sort of conditions did you have in mind?" he asked, his tone neither dismissive nor overly eager, simply curious as one might be when entering any complex negotiation. Martha had anticipated this question and had spent part of her sleepless night formulating her terms. She gestured toward the cabin door. "Perhaps we should discuss this inside. The morning is cool now, but it won't remain so for long." Jackson nodded, following her into the modest dwelling. The interior of Martha's cabin was neat and functional, with a few touches that spoke of the woman who inhabited it. Dried wildflowers in a jar on the table, a patchwork quilt draped over the back of a rocking chair, books stacked carefully on a small shelf. Jackson seemed to take in these details with interest as Martha busied herself pouring coffee from the pot she'd had warming on the stove. "Black?" she asked, holding up a mug, and he nodded, accepting it with a murmured thanks. They sat across from each other at the small table, the formality of the situation at odds with the intimate setting. "My conditions are as follows," Martha began, her hands wrapped around her own coffee mug as much for comfort as warmth. "First, the Wellington homestead remains in my name, separate from your property. We may operate them as one ranch, but legally, this land remains mine." She watched Jackson's face carefully for any sign of objection, but his expression remained neutral as he listened. "Second, I expect to be consulted on all significant ranch decisions, cattle purchases, hiring of hands, expansion plans. My voice carries equal weight to yours in these matters." She took a sip of coffee, gathering courage for her next stipulation. "Third, I retain the right to end our arrangement if it proves unsatisfactory to either party." Jackson's eyebrows rose slightly at this last condition. "You're proposing we include the possibility of divorce in our marriage agreement?" he asked, his tone indicating surprise rather than disapproval. Martha nodded, her chin raised slightly in defiance. "It seems only practical, given the circumstances," she replied. "Neither of us enters this union with romantic notions. If the partnership fails to function as intended, it should be dissolved rather than endured." She set her mug down carefully. "And finally, I would request a period of adjustment before our marriage includes all traditional aspects of such a relationship." A slight flush colored her cheeks as she made this last stipulation, but she maintained eye contact, unwilling to show embarrassment about a perfectly reasonable request. To her relief, Jackson simply nodded, showing no sign of mockery or offense. "Your terms seem fair," he said, after a moment's consideration. "I would add only that any children born of our union would inherit both properties equally, regardless of which parcel of land they originated from." It was Martha's turn to show surprise. The mention of children had not featured in her calculations of this arrangement. "Children," she repeated, the word feeling strange on her tongue in this context. At 32, she had long since resigned herself to childlessness, having rejected the few marriage proposals she'd received in her youth and finding prospects increasingly limited as she aged. The possibility of motherhood, even now, sent an unexpected pang through her chest, a mixture of longing and fear she hadn't anticipated. "Yes," she finally agreed, "that seems reasonable, should such a development occur." She paused, studying Jackson's face across the table. "Are we in agreement, then?" Jackson extended his hand across the table, his expression solemn. "We are, Miss Wellington, or should I say, Mrs. Hargrove-to-be." The formality of the handshake struck Martha as oddly fitting. They were, after all, concluding a business arrangement as much as agreeing to a marriage. Yet, as her smaller hand was enveloped in his calloused palm, she felt an unexpected warmth spread up her arm, a physical response that had nothing to do with practical considerations or survival strategies. She withdrew her hand perhaps a bit more hastily than necessary, disconcerted by her body's betrayal of her carefully maintained emotional distance. "There's the matter of when," she said, rising from the table to refill her coffee, using the activity to mask any lingering flush in her cheeks. "The courthouse in Silver Creek has hours only on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. Today is Thursday." She turned back to face Jackson, leaning against the stove. "And I imagine we should inform the community of our arrangement before appearing before Judge Wilson. People talk, Mr. Hargrove. I would prefer they not speculate that you've compromised my reputation prior to our official union." Jackson stood, his imposing height seeming even greater in the confined space of the cabin. "I agree," he said, setting his empty mug on the table. "Propriety matters, especially out here where reputations are sometimes all we have." He considered for a moment. "There's a social at the church in Silver Creek on Saturday evening. Most of the county will be there. We could announce our engagement then and marry before Judge Wilson on Monday morning." He smiled slightly, the expression transforming his usually stern features. "Would that timeline suit you, Miss Wellington?" Martha nodded, surprised at how quickly theoretical plans were becoming concrete reality. In less than a week, she would be Jackson Hargrove's wife, a thought both terrifying and strangely exhilarating. That would be acceptable. she agreed, her voice betraying none of the tumult beneath her calm exterior. I suppose we should discuss practical matters as well. When would you expect me to relocate to your property? The question hung between them, laden with implications about the nature of their relationship and how quickly it would assume all the aspects of a traditional marriage. There's no rush on that front, Jackson replied, seeming to understand the unspoken concerns behind her question. The drought won't last forever. Once it breaks, we can assess which dwelling makes more sense as our primary residence. He moved toward the door, pausing with his hand on the latch. In the meantime, we have water troughs to install and cattle to save. Would you care to supervise the work on your property today? As my future partner, your input would be valued. The offer, made with apparent sincerity, caught Martha off guard. Perhaps Jackson truly did intend to honor his promise of a genuine partnership. I would, she said, making her decision quickly. Give me a moment to change into something more suitable for ranch work. Jackson nodded and stepped outside to wait, closing the door behind him. Alone again, Martha pressed her hands to her cheeks, feeling the warmth there. What had she done? Agreed to marry a virtual stranger out of necessity and pragmatism. Yet as she changed into her work clothes, she couldn't deny the small flutter of something like anticipation in her stomach. Jackson Hargrove was not the husband she had imagined for herself in her younger years. But perhaps he was the partner she needed now, strong, capable, and surprisingly respectful of her terms. Only time would tell if their arrangement of convenience might grow into something more meaningful. For now, she had a spring to protect and a future to secure, one practical decision at a time. The Saturday evening social at Silver Creek's small wooden church was the highlight of the month for most inhabitants of the surrounding ranches and homesteads. It provided a rare opportunity for scattered neighbors to gather, share news, and enjoy simple pleasures like music and dancing. Martha had attended these functions sporadically since her father's death, finding them painful reminders of her increasing isolation within the community. Tonight, however, was different. Tonight, she arrived on Jackson Hargrove's arm, wearing her blue calico dress freshly pressed and her honey blonde hair arranged in a style more elaborate than her usual practical bun. Their entrance caused the subtle ripple of whispers and curious glances Martha had anticipated. Jackson Hargrove, arriving with any woman, would have been noteworthy. His appearance with Martha Wellington, whose property adjoined his and with whom he'd had well-known water disputes, was nothing short of sensational. Martha felt her cheeks warm under the scrutiny, but kept her chin high, determined not to appear embarrassed or uncertain about her decision. Jackson seemed oblivious to the stares, or perhaps simply accustomed to being the center of attention as one of the territory's most successful ranchers. Mrs. Miller, Jackson greeted the pastor's wife warmly, tipping his hat to the plump, cheerful woman who served as the community's unofficial social director. May I present Miss Martha Wellington, my fiancée. We're to be married Monday morning, before Judge Wilson. The simple declaration, delivered in his matter-of-fact manner, caused Mrs. Miller's eyes to widen momentarily before she recovered her composure. Why, Mr. Hargrove, Miss Wellington, what wonderful news! She clasped Martha's hand between both of hers, beaming with what appeared to be genuine pleasure. A spring wedding, how appropriate and lovely. Martha managed a smile, touched by the woman's enthusiasm, despite the calculating looks they were receiving from others in the room. Thank you, Mrs. Miller. It's a rather expedient arrangement, but we're quite pleased. The half-truth came easier than she had expected. Glancing up at Jackson's profile, his strong features illuminated by the church's oil lamps. Martha found that she was not entirely displeased with the prospect of becoming his wife. Over the past 2 days, as they had worked side by side diverting water to save his cattle while ensuring her pond remained sufficiently full, she had glimpsed aspects of his character that intrigued her. His patience with his ranch hands, his knowledge of the land, his unexpected consideration for her opinions on the placement of the troughs. The social proceeded, as such gatherings always did, with refreshments served on trestle tables, music provided by local amateurs on fiddles and harmonicas, and dancing in the cleared space before the pulpit. What differed was Martha's experience of it all. Instead of hovering at the edges, exchanging polite but distant greetings with neighbors who viewed her with a mixture of pity and vague unease, she found herself at the center of attention. Women who had barely acknowledged her in the past now sought her company, eager for details about her courtship with Jackson. Men who had previously looked through her as though she were invisible now tipped their hats respectfully, addressing her as though her impending marriage had suddenly rendered her visible. "May I have this dance, Miss Wellington?" Jackson's voice interrupted her thoughts as a lively reel began. Martha hesitated briefly. Dancing had never been her strong suit, and the prospect of stumbling through the steps before the entire community was daunting. But refusing would seem odd for an engaged couple, so she nodded, allowing Jackson to lead her onto the makeshift dance floor. To her surprise, he was a capable dancer, his large hands steady and guiding as they moved through the patterns of the reel. "You dance well for a rancher, Mr. Hargrove," she commented during a brief pause in the music. Jackson's mouth quirked in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "My mother insisted all her sons learn. Said no woman would have us if we couldn't manage a proper quadrille." There was a softness in his voice when he mentioned his mother, a tenderness Martha hadn't heard before. It occurred to her how little she knew about this man who would be her husband in less than 48 hours, his family, his past before establishing his ranch, his hopes beyond mere survival and prosperity. Perhaps there would be time to learn these things, to build a foundation of understanding, if not affection. The music resumed, and they moved again in unison, their bodies finding a natural rhythm that required no words. Later, as they stood together, accepting congratulations from neighbors and acquaintances, Martha felt Jackson's hand settle at the small of her back, a gesture that was proprietorial without being possessive, supportive rather than controlling. It was, she realized, not entirely unwelcome. "Are you ready to head back?" he asked quietly as the gathering began to thin, sensitive to her increasing fatigue after hours of socializing. Martha nodded gratefully, having reached the limits of her endurance for curious questions and meaningful looks. The ride back would be long, and tomorrow was their last day as separate individuals. Monday would bring permanent change, for better or worse. The journey to Martha's homestead was made largely in comfortable silence, the night air cool against their faces as Jackson's wagon rolled along the rutted track. Stars spangled the vast Montana sky, a display of natural splendor that never failed to humble Martha, regardless of her personal circumstances. As they approached her cabin, Jackson cleared his throat, breaking the quiet. "I've been thinking about what you said, about maintaining your independence within our partnership." His voice was thoughtful in the darkness. "I want you to know I meant what I said about valuing your input. This arrangement may have begun with water rights, but I believe it can become something worthwhile for both of us." Martha turned to study his profile in the moonlight, struck by the sincerity in his tone. "I hope you're right, Mr. Hargrove," she replied softly. "I've grown accustomed to making my own decisions, living on my own terms. That won't change easily." She hesitated, then added, "But I'm willing to try, if you are, to build something between us that's more than just a legal convenience." The admission cost her something in pride, but it felt important to voice these thoughts now, before vows were exchanged and expectations solidified. Jackson nodded, his expression thoughtful, as he brought the wagon to a halt before her cabin. "I am willing," he said simply, stepping down to help her from the wagon. His hands were strong and steady at her waist as he lifted her to the ground, lingering perhaps a moment longer than necessary before releasing her. "Monday morning, then. I'll come for you at 8. He hesitated, as though considering whether some further gesture was appropriate. A handshake seemed too formal, a kiss too presumptuous for their current relationship. In the end, he simply tipped his hat, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that sent an unexpected shiver down Martha's spine. "Good night, Miss Wellington. Sleep well." As Martha watched him drive away, the wagon gradually disappearing into the darkness, she was struck by the strangeness of her situation. 2 days from now, she would be Martha Hargrove, wife to a man she was only beginning to know, mistress of a substantial ranch operation, no longer alone in the vast Montana wilderness. The thought should have terrified her. Perhaps it did on some level, but mixed with the apprehension was a curious anticipation. A tentative hope that this marriage of necessity might evolve into something neither of them had anticipated when Jackson first approached her with his ultimatum about the spring. Water might have brought them together, but perhaps something deeper would keep them that way. Monday dawned clear and cool, a perfect spring day that seemed to offer its blessing on the unlikely union about to take place. Martha dressed with care in her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved for decades in hopes of a day Martha had long since stopped expecting. The gown was simple by Eastern standards, cream-colored cotton with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs. But it represented a connection to her past, to the woman who had braved the journey west with her father when Martha was just a child. As she pinned her hair up and added a sprig of wildflowers as her only adornment, Martha allowed herself a moment of contemplation in her small mirror. The woman who gazed back at her looked calm, determined, perhaps even hopeful. Not the traditional blushing bride of romance novels, but a woman making a clear-eyed choice for her future. Jackson arrived precisely at 8, driving a freshly painted buggy rather than his usual work wagon. Too had made an effort with his appearance, wearing a crisp white shirt beneath a dark suit that had clearly been brushed and pressed for the occasion. He stopped at the sight of Martha on her porch, his expression shifting from polite anticipation to something warmer, more appreciative. "Miss Wellington," he greeted her, removing his hat. "You look—" He seemed at a loss for words, an unusual circumstance for a man typically so direct and articulate. "Beautiful," he finally managed, the single word carrying more weight than any elaborate compliment. The ceremony at Judge Wilson's office was brief and to the point, witnessed by Mrs. Miller and her husband, the pastor, who had driven into town specifically for the occasion. The judge, who had unwittingly played matchmaker through his enforcement of water rights law, seemed quietly pleased as he pronounced them husband and wife. "You may kiss the bride," he instructed Jackson, who hesitated momentarily, glancing at Martha as though seeking permission. She gave a slight nod, and he leaned forward, placing a gentle, almost tentative kiss on her lips. Their first physical contact of this nature. It lasted only a moment, but Martha felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with embarrassment and everything to do with an unexpected chemistry between them. "Well, Mrs. Hargrove," Jackson said, as they exited the courthouse into the bright spring sunshine, "what would you like to do first as a married woman? We could have lunch at the hotel dining room, or perhaps you'd like to visit the general store. I understand they've received new fabric from back east." His consideration for her preferences, his effort to make this day special, despite its pragmatic origins, touched Martha deeply. She smiled up at him, realizing it was the first genuine smile she had directed his way since their unusual courtship began. "Lunch would be lovely," she replied. "And then I think we should head home. We have a ranch to run, after all." As they drove toward her homestead, their homestead now, later that afternoon, the Montana landscape spread before them in all its rugged glory. Martha found herself reflecting on the strange path that had led her to this moment. A drought, a water dispute, a pragmatic proposal that had seemed more like an ultimatum at the time. Not the romance she had dreamed of as a girl, certainly. Yet as Jackson's hand occasionally brushed hers on the buggy seat, as they discussed plans for combining their operations with the easy rapport of partners who respected each other's knowledge, Martha felt a cautious optimism growing within her. Perhaps, in time, this marriage of convenience might become something neither of them had anticipated when he first rode onto her land and announced, "I'm taking your water." Perhaps they might find, in each other, not just security and practical support, but companionship, understanding, and even love. The spring that had been the catalyst for their union sparkled in the afternoon sun as they approached, its waters now flowing partly to nourish Jackson's cattle, partly to maintain Martha's pond. Like the water itself, their lives had now been diverted into a single channel, joining two separate entities into one stronger, more resilient whole. As Jackson helped Martha down from the buggy, his hands lingering at her waist, their eyes met in a moment of silent communication, acknowledgement of all that had passed between them and all that might yet come. They had begun as adversaries, evolved into reluctant partners, and now stood as husband and wife. What they would become to each other in the days, months, and years ahead remained to be discovered, one day at a time, on the vast, unforgiving, beautiful Montana frontier that had brought them together in the most unexpected of ways.